Hey everyone, in this video we are going to look at the anchor point in SpriteKit, clear up some confusion around it, and I'll show you some tips to make it work the way you want. Alright, first let's understand what the anchor point actually is. Think of it as a unit coordinate system inside your sprite where 0, 0 is the bottom left corner and 1, 1 is the top right. And later in the video, once we understand more about how the anchor point affects movement, we are gonna build a ship circling around a buoy. When you have an SKSpriteNode, its anchor point will be set by default to 0.5, 0.5, which is the center. So in this case, the ship is rotating around its center. If we change the anchor point to 0, 0, the asset will start rotating around its bottom left corner. Analogously, if we change it to 0, 1, it will start rotating around its top left corner. If we change it to 1, 0, it will start rotating around its bottom right corner. And as expected, if we set it to 1, 1, it will start rotating around its top right corner. However, we are allowed to set it to any arbitrary point. So, for example, when we set it to 0.7, 0.3, you can see how it's rotating then. What you might have noticed is that whenever we changed the ship's anchor point, the anchor point was still exactly in the middle of the scene. In other words, by changing the anchor point, we repositioned the ship. And the reason for that is that the scene also has an anchor point, which is set to 0.5, 0.5 by default in the SKS file when we create a new Xcode project. So let's say we have the default scene with 0.5, 0.5 anchor point, and an asset with 0.5, 0.5 anchor point as well. In such a case, the scene has its anchor point right in the middle of the scene. And this is exactly where we place the asset's anchor point as well. If we change the asset's anchor point to 0, 0, the anchor point will still be placed exactly where the scene's anchor point is. So it means that the asset itself needs to reposition. In other words, the anchor point defines the position within a node that is considered the origin, the 0, 0 point used for positioning and transformations. For example, if we now change the scene's anchor point to 0, 0, it will be moved to the bottom left corner together with the asset. If we change the asset back to 0.5, 0.5, you will see that now only 1/4 of the asset is visible in the scene. That's because we haven't set the asset's position yet, which is by default set to 0, 0. But don't confuse it with the scene's anchor point 0, 0. That's completely different. When we previously had scene set to 0.5, 0.5, it meant that the origin point was in the middle of the scene. And now, when the scene has the anchor point set to 0, 0, it means that the new origin is in the bottom left corner. There may be a use case for having the origin point in the bottom left corner instead of the middle. And let's say you now want the asset to be in the middle even with this scene's anchor point. So what we can do here is that instead of placing the asset to the origin, we add half the scene's width to its x and half the scene's height to its y. What we should also point out here is that scaling is also affected by the anchor point. For example, when you have an asset with anchor point set to 0, 0, and you double its size using scaling, scaling is done relative to the anchor point. So in this case, the node will grow upward and rightward from that bottom left corner. And if we now try the same with the 0.5, 0.5 anchor point, the scaling will happen evenly in all directions from the center. It's also worth pointing out that it doesn't affect physics body. For example, when we change the anchor point from the default 0.5, 0.5 to something like 0, 0, you might expect the physics body to shift accordingly, but the physics body is still created around the node's center, so it doesn't move with the anchor point. So to fix that, you may need to adjust the physics body position. Let's open up a new Xcode project and we can try some things out. Let's set the background color, for example, to system cyan to resemble the ocean. And let's add a red buoy using the SKShapeNode. Unlike Scene or SKSpriteNode, SKShapeNode doesn't have an anchor point, so it's positioned around its center. When we run the app now, we'll see a red circle right in the middle of the screen. Let's now add a ship with the default 0.5, 0.5 anchor point. It's not actually necessary to set this explicitly since it's the default, but I'm including it here to make things clear for the demo. And since the scene is also using the default 0.5, 0.5 anchor point, it means that the origin point is in the middle of the scene. And so to place it a bit to the right of the buoy, we can set its X to, for example, 150. When we now run the app, we'll see that the ship is rendered next to the buoy. Now we can add an SKLabel node with the text player 1, for example, under the ship. And like SKShapeNode, this one doesn't have an anchor point either, so we need to position it manually. However, in this case, we can use its vertical alignment mode to help align the text more easily relative to its position. And lastly, we can also add a nested SKSpriteNode, for example, to represent a crew member. It will have the default anchor point and it will be positioned on the right side of the ship. Now, let's make the ship circle around the buoy using what we've learned so far. First, if we just add a rotation action directly to the ship, say a 5-second full rotation that runs forever, it will only spin the ship in place, and that's not quite what we want. We can try positioning the ship to the center of the scene and then changing its anchor point to 0.51. Now we can see it starts going in circles, but they are very small. But we can also see that it causes issues for the nested nodes. To just make the circles bigger is very simple because 1 isn't the maximum number we can use in the anchor point. So if we increase that number, the circle will get bigger. But to fix the nested nodes, let's try a different approach. Instead, to make the ship circle around the buoy, we can rotate the ship by 90 degrees to set its facing direction and then add it as a child to a new SK node. We can call it pivot. And by rotating this pivot node continuously, the ship will move in a circle around the buoy. This works because when you rotate the pivot node, all its children, including the ship, rotate around the pivot's position. And since the ship is offset from the pivot, it moves in a circular path around it. So that's anchor points in SpriteKit, how they work, how they affect positioning, rotation, and scaling, and even how they come into play with nested nodes. We saw a quick way to make the ship circle by shifting the anchor point, and a cleaner way using a pivot node when you've got children attached. Anchor points can be a bit tricky at first, but once you get comfortable with them, you'll have much more control over your scenes. I hope you found this useful, and if you did, consider liking the video and subscribing for more SpriteKit videos. Thanks for watching.